This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.
Welcome to the Fatigue Fixer podcast. Ever wonder why it feels like the entire sisterhood is just so darn exhausted? We're diving deep into everything from those sneaky physical culprits, think iron levels playing hide and seek or a moody thyroid, to the mental weights of always being on and that sneaky urge to please everyone. And let's not forget society's oh-so-high bar that we're tirelessly trying to reach. I'm Dr. Sarah Vedbonkar, your guide on this energy-finding mission. As a naturopathic doctor with over a decade of experience, I've been piecing together the fatigue puzzle, asking why so many incredible women around me, including my patients, often feel like they're running on empty. So pull up a chair or perhaps pop in your headphones and head out for a walk. Together we'll uncover those hidden, surprising, and sometimes even downright unexpected reasons behind that lingering tiredness. Ready to recharge those batteries? All right, deep breath. Let's jump into today's insightful episode. Welcome back to the Fatigue Fixer podcast, where we explore why so many women are so effing tired. Today, we're talking about a stage of life where a lot of women start experiencing a whole new level of fatigue, menopause. According to a new report by the Menopause Foundation of Canada, there are 2 million women in Canada between the ages of 45 and 55, the ages where most women go through menopause. And 50% of women in Canada say they are unprepared for menopause, with less than a quarter of us believing that we are very knowledgeable about the signs and symptoms of perimenopause and menopause. And the stat that really got me is that it is estimated that 1 in 10 women will leave the workforce due to the unmanaged symptoms of menopause. There is no reason in 2023 that women should have to leave the workforce because of menopause symptoms when we have a variety of safe and effective treatments. This is the one where your period stops, and my guest today is part of a growing chorus of voices trying to change the face of menopause for women. Dr. Ardelle Piper is a Royal College certified OB/GYN located in Ottawa, Canada. After getting a Bachelor of Science in Cell and Developmental Biology, she achieved her medical degree at the University of British Columbia in 2006. Passionate for women's health and education, she pursued obstetrics and gynecology residency and a master's in education in Saskatchewan. In 2013, she came to Ottawa to complete subspecialty training in midlife women's health at the Shirley E. Greenberg Women's Health Center in Ottawa. She has held the Menopause Society Certified Practitioner designation since 2014. Dr. Piper is now a pioneer in virtual care, providing telemedicine menopause assessments to women across Ontario since 2020. Her virtual menopause clinic focuses on menopause education, hormone therapy, post-cancer thrivership, sexual function, and preventative health promotion. And I know so many of the patients that I have are so grateful that you are here in Ottawa because you are such a needed resource for women going through menopause. So Dr. Piper, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thanks for inviting me.
Thank you for being here. I'm really excited for this conversation.
Me too.
So I'm sure you saw the report that came out, I think it was a week or two ago, with some of the stats that I listed. And I was shocked at that 1 in 10 women are leaving the workplace. And, you know, there's been such a big spotlight put on menopause, I feel, in the last couple years, which I think is fantastic. And yet, despite that, I think so many women are still lacking some of the knowledge they need to navigate this. And they're often not aware of all the treatments and, lifestyle stuff that they can do to help support that. So what are some of the knowledge gaps that you're still seeing with the women that you treat in your practice?
I'm still seeing people being themselves afraid or being told, unfortunately, sometimes even by still healthcare providers, that hormone therapy is dangerous, right? I still have clients who've said to me that they are suffering with their symptoms, but they don't want hormone therapy because they have a grandmother who had breast cancer or because they have a grandparent who had a heart attack or a stroke. And I actually still see it quoted in referrals being sent to me by other healthcare providers saying, this person is suffering with their symptoms, but unfortunately, I cannot start them on hormone therapy. We had a discussion where they understand that there's an increased risk of stroke and cardiovascular disease and clot, and like it's reading them the riot act every time. And that's unfortunate because that's, really quite outdated information for us to still be perpetuating.
Yeah, I see that all the time too. And I really want to get into some of those specifics you just mentioned because I hear those all the time. And they are outdated. And I think some of that misinformation and some of that outdated information really prevents a lot of women from accessing treatments that are actually very safe and can be very effective. And I think what's important for women to know and to understand is that HRT is the gold standard treatment for the treatment of the symptoms of menopause. And I want to talk about some of the pros and cons of that because I do think a lot of women would probably suffer a lot less if they had a better understanding of what HRT actually is capable of and what the risks are. So let's start with the breast cancer piece. So this is something I hear all the time too. Well, I can't have HRT because my grandmother had breast cancer or my aunt had breast cancer. Can we talk about the breast cancer risk and the fact that women can still safely have HRT even if they have a family history of breast cancer? What's the kind of latest guidelines around breast cancer and HRT?
Well, the latest guidelines about breast cancer actually appreciate that there are many things that contribute to breast cancer risk. So I think that's the first important thing for women to know is that sometimes these discussions about breast cancer risk haven't even been had until something like their severe menopause symptoms come up and they're seeking solutions and they're being told, well, you can't because breast cancer. And so then that sort of lights it up for them that, oh my gosh, this is something that will increase my risk. And we're not having enough discussions with women about how much extra weight affects their risk, how much alcohol intake affects their risk, how much being sedentary and not exercising, which of course often, goes hand in hand with then having extra weight and such. But then of course, family history. Having one grandmother or one aunt who had breast cancer, it can be representative of the fact that there's a 1 in 8 chance of all of us to have breast cancer. That's just our population-based risk. So the family history is important. If there are multiple people who've had breast or ovarian or even colon cancer, suggesting that maybe there's a genetic mutation in that family that's being passed along that is increasing your risk from a genetic perspective. And if your risk is increased from a genetic perspective, that's going to be your biggest risk of breast cancer overall, right? So there are better charts that are coming out now, I think, that are helping to contextualize this and show, the impact of, how much extra alcohol. There's a linear relationship between how much alcohol you drink and how much that then affects, and again, not just breast cancer, all sorts of diseases and cancers, heart disease, stroke, risk, all these different things are impacted by increasing alcohol intake. And so we're not doing women favors if we're sort of only having this discussion about breast cancer risk when hormone therapy comes up. And that creates that's a disinformation, right? That creates an illusion that that's really the only thing that they have to be worried about.
Yeah. And I think as a general rule, we're not very good at assessing and understanding risk when it comes to our health. And I think for so long, women had this connection in their brain that estrogen equals breast cancer. And especially if you heard that 20 years ago, it might be really hard for you to unlearn that or think about it differently. But like you said, most women don't, when you pour your glass of wine, you're probably not thinking, ooh, this is going to increase my risk of breast cancer. Most women continue to drink alcohol. We continue to not go for the walks that we know we probably should be going on. And yet we are avoiding this therapy because of the small risk. Can we talk about the actual risk? Can you give us a little bit of context, maybe in terms of numbers? How many extra women might get breast cancer if they're taking HRT versus women who aren't? Do we have some of that data?
Well, there's rough data about that, which will, give you a number of a few per 1,000.
Yeah.
The trick is that it's so contextualized, right? So we don't know how much you can separate out those risk factors to then say, well, how much is this purely because of hormone therapy? Again,
Right.
studies like the WHI might give us some of those estimations of how many per thousands of women. But how does breast density factor into there? Right? How does your obesity potentially overlap with how much then hormone therapy might also change your risk? Right? It's really hard to take those out of context. And then what about doses? And what about formulations? And what about how long you're on hormone therapy? All of those things contribute to those number conversations. So generally speaking, right now, most of the guidelines, and you can look at the Canadian Menopause Society guidelines, NAMS has been renamed to the Menopause Society. I don't know if anyone's calling them the TMS now
Okay.
instead of the like the DMS and the SCM. Yeah, so they're now called the Menopause Society. Anyways, their guidelines have been updated. So have the British ones. And all of them are saying really for women who are highly symptomatic and whose quality of life is being severely impacted by their menopause symptoms, there shouldn't be a concern that if you are young and newly in your menopausal transition and you need therapy so that you can function, so that you can sleep. Let's talk about how important it is for people to sleep. You're not doing yourselves favors by avoiding hormone therapy and then leaving yourself in sleep deprivation, with horrible mood, thinking that you're going to leave your job, then putting your financial security at risk, which then impacts on your financial wellness, which then impacts on your activity. Like all of these things trickle down if you don't treat symptoms, right?
Yeah.
So if you are new in your menopause, you should then look at what your options are. You should try to address those symptoms, and you shouldn't be concerned that if you are a young, low-risk individual newly in your menopause, you shouldn't be concerned that hormone therapy is going to give you breast cancer in the next, 5 years if you're using it. And again, I think that sometimes is sort of a bad game of telephone, right? When people say, and they will say to me, well, my mom had breast cancer, diagnosed, 6 months after she started hormone therapy. So the hormone therapy gave her breast cancer. Well, no, unfortunately, that breast cancer was there and was growing already for years before. The other thing is that when we are looking at breast cancer diagnoses, we look for receptors on them that help us with treatment strategies. So all people's breasts with their receptors will have estrogen and progesterone receptors by default. They're supposed to. That's why your breasts are reactive when you have PMS or when you're pregnant. All of those cells, if they are normal, will have estrogen and progesterone receptors on them. So a cancer will be assessed for those receptors to see if we can use estrogen blocking agents to do something that will then suppress the potential growth of cells. That doesn't mean that estrogen gave you a cancer. That doesn't mean that all of a sudden you have to avoid hormone therapy because your mother or grandmother's cancer was estrogen receptor positive. It's actually a relatively good thing if you've got estrogen receptors on your breast cancer cells because it shows that they haven't gone so far wonky that they've lost them. It means we have that as a tool to try to help you survive longer with your cancer. Triple negative cancers are actually worse, right? Mm-hmm. So again, I think it ends up being then that overall this just creates this culture of fear that, estrogen itself is toxic, estrogen is bad, you should try to avoid it. And that creates a lot of confusion, especially now when there's people out there who are in the other camp of saying, menopause is a hormone deficiency and estrogen is a natural hormone you've had all your life and you should continue to have it for the rest of your life. It leaves a lot of people sort of confused in the middle of saying, well, is estrogen bad for me or is it good for me? And and that is a particularly confusing topic when people are worried about their breasts.
Yeah. I think there's such a hate on for estrogen right now, sadly, in on social media and in the wellness sphere. And I kind of tell women, you're going to miss estrogen when she leaves. Estrogen is your friend, your brain's friend, your heart, your bones, all of your different body parts need and love estrogen. It's not the cause of our problems. And certainly, like you said, it is not the cause on its own of breast cancer. And going back to this idea of risk, one of the conversations I'm having in my office all the time is helping women understand that their greatest risk of disease and death after menopause is not breast cancer, it's heart disease. And we know that HRT can be helpful in terms of keeping women with better cholesterol levels, healthy arteries. So can we talk about some of the benefits for heart health in particular?
Yeah. Now, we'll start, though, that question with a caveat to say at this point, we don't have the strong evidence to suggest that hormone therapy should be recommended as primary prevention of cardiovascular disease, right?
Yeah.
So yes, we do have data, particularly when women have gone through early menopause, so premature ovarian insufficiency, having your ovaries removed, any of those things that artificially put you into menopause, prematurely in your 30s and your 40s. We have clear evidence to say that, that then can leave you without that protective effect of estrogen for a longer period of time in your life than was already sort of preordained by your genetics. And so in those situations, we shouldn't let those women feel that those risk conversations are the same for them in their 30s and 40s as it is when we're having that risk conversation in their 50s and 60s. Because in your 50s and 60s, and if you want to be a long-term hormone therapy user because your symptoms are still there in your 70s, you have an age-related risk of breast cancer that is going up. You have an age-related change in your risk of having a clot. And so those conversations need to be slightly different, looking at how your aging process has been, what other risk factors you have accumulated by now. And for most people who are in their 30s and 40s, or very newly going through their menopause in their late 40s, early 50s and such, their final menstrual period, for most people, they haven't accumulated those amounts of damage yet, right? And so that's an important part of that conversation. So,
And,
go ahead.
I was going to say, isn't it also true that, again, generally women who use HRT have a lower risk of dying from all causes versus women who have never used HRT?
That does come out in the data, but again, I would kind of take some issue with that data because again, who are we representing with that data? So far, most of the studies that are observing women who are on hormone therapy are observing women who've had the privilege and the access to hormone therapy, right? So we don't have all women who have horrible symptoms and are indicated to be offered hormone therapy. We don't have them all getting hormone therapy, right? And so it ends up being that there still is a bias right now in the literature when we're making these conclusions about what can we say about women who are on hormone therapy versus not, especially when it comes to long-term outcomes. Because a lot of women who could benefit from hormone therapy long-term are not being offered it. And there is a connection now that is being shown out more and more in the literature that untreated menopausal symptoms, particularly hot flushes and night sweats, have a correlation with later onset or with later development of cardiovascular disease. So then that begs the question of, well, is it people who have increased risk of cardiovascular disease, whose vessels then may be already just a little bit vulnerable to then hot flushes, or is it the repeated and untreated severe hot flushes that then over time create some damage to your vessels and predispose you to cardiovascular disease? That answer, I haven't heard clearly. I think both of those are hypotheses rolling around. But it sort of, again, speaks to that issue of if you have symptoms, we should treat them. If you don't have symptoms, if you don't have severe hot flushes and night sweats and whatever, then we don't yet have that clear data about saying going on hormone therapy as primary prevention will reduce your risk of cardiovascular disease. I think that is, it very definitely being studied, but the results have not been able to kind of now be interpreted and then put into guidelines yet.
Okay. And I think I want to repeat something Dr. Piper said, because I think it's really important. Hot flashes and night sweats are not just like an inconvenience that we need to suffer through. Mm-hmm. They are often a sign of massive changes happening in the body, most of which we cannot see or tell that are happening or measure in any kind of way, but that are going to have a significant impact on our health and our, wellness for the rest of our lives. And again, women, like you said, women who have severe hot flashes, that could be a sign of cardiovascular risk. So you want to be assessed and you ideally do want to treat those symptoms.
Yeah.
So
there's an element of menopause that is a bit mysterious, right? There are people who don't have a lot of hot flushes and night sweats, and they're not suffering. And they do carry on into their menopause. They've got good nutrition, they're exercising, they don't have, genetic predisposers to osteoporosis. Women who can't be on hormone therapy, who've had breast cancer, or who don't want to be on hormone therapy or don't need to be on hormone therapy, we need to make sure that they are not feeling like somehow they are missing the boat because of this messaging out there of, yes, estrogen has been good for you. Yes, we shouldn't fear estrogen, but we shouldn't also we should make sure that argument doesn't get overgeneralized into saying, and therefore all women should be feeling like they have to use estrogen as part of their wellness plan going forwards, because, that's primary prevention and we don't have that yet.
Yeah. And so that answers one of the questions that was submitted for you, which is should I start HRT if I don't have symptoms? Like if I'm not having hot flashes and night sweats, should I be thinking about HRT?
Well, we sometimes, though, as well, simplify menopause to hot flushes and night sweats, right? And you can decide to argue this either way. One is that yes, hot flushes and night sweats have for a long time been a symptom that can severely impact on people's ability to function, and of course, as we've mentioned already, can impact on people's other risks like heart disease. Okay. And so if hot flushes and night sweats are a part of your symptomatology, then yeah, the data is very clear that hormone therapy can be a gold standard for that. But as we know, there are people who can have all sorts of other symptoms in their menopause. And some of these other symptoms we're not yet quantifying well enough. People describe joint pain and sort of generalized digestive issues. And, there's some question as to whether or not your gut microbiome changes once you go through menopause. Dry skin. Now people are talking about itchy ears and burning mouth. And a lot of these symptoms are cropping up. But I would say that right now we don't have enough data, again, to say how much of those are going to be specifically because of the drops in estrogen, how much of those might be because of other things that are going on in your life around that transition. And not only that, but then how many of those symptoms might improve with hormone therapy versus being part of the menopause transition that we have to go through. The cognitive symptoms, for example, of menopause for many people with the brain fog and the lack of concentration and the word finding difficulty and such. There are people like Dr. Pauline Mackey who are doing excellent research on this, and Lisa Mosconi, she's another one, who are saying some of this is sort of a reshuffling and reorganizing of your nerves, where a lot of people will go on to hormone therapy and that symptom doesn't improve. And that's because we have to remind people that hormone therapy is not reversing your menopause. It's not stopping you from going through menopause. These are excessively low doses that are meant to hit on, major symptomatology and major risks. Like, for example, if you are hitting your menopause already at extremely elevated risk of osteoporosis, there's data to say, consider adding some estrogen in there as one of the many things that you can do to reduce your risk. The North American Menopause Society as well, with their statements of indications for hormone therapy. They've always said, yes, hot flushes and night sweats and et cetera, osteoporosis prevention. But they do say in there now that, for people who have significant mood issues that come up as part of this menopausal transition, particularly if people have had mood issues that were also maybe part of their postpartum or their pregnancy or as part of their PMS, these might be people who have a greater sensitivity to hormone fluctuations than affecting their mood. So you can consider a trial of hormone therapy. And so, there are some of these, many different symptoms, and some people will tell the list as high as 34. I'm not quite sure that we can be that specific about knowing that there are 34 symptoms of menopause. But either way, some of these things that are sort of on the edges of, well, we don't really know. Then you have to be doing a risk assessment and saying, well, what are the impacts of these symptoms? Maybe not hot flushes, but symptoms X, Y, Z. What is the impact of those on my life? What is my risk of being on hormone therapy? If I want to consider a trial, how can I choose a formulation that will be giving me the less risk? And then having a plan of saying, no one's going to be harmed by a trial of 3 to 6 months to see if this really does make a difference for some of these other symptoms that we don't have a really good understanding of yet. And that's where it becomes really important to have a good, trusting relationship with your provider, where you can have kind of some of those messy conversations, where you can appreciate what we know and what we don't know, and where you can have some trust and some shared decision making about saying, let's make a plan that is specific to you, that appreciates the data we have out there, appreciates the evidence-based approach that we want to have, but also appreciates that there are some unknowns and that you are an individual, right?
Yeah. And I want to have that in our conversation today, kind of how to help guide women to have these conversations with their doctors, because I think there are still some knowledge gaps, like you said, when we started in the medical community. And I think one of the things that I often share with my patients, specifically around the memory changes, because I think memory changes can be quite scary, especially if you have a family history of Alzheimer's or dementia. And a lot of women start to wonder, am I getting dementia? Is this going to last forever? And from my understanding, this is one of the symptoms that definitely seems to stabilize post-menopause. So the perimenopause transition is probably going to be the most difficult time for most women in terms of symptoms generally, and including some of the mood and memory changes. And then typically once you've had no bleeding for a year and you're officially in menopause, some of these symptoms will start to go away or at least reduce and stabilize. Is that what you're seeing as well, Dr. Piper?
Well, not even necessarily that quickly. Like again, that criteria of 12 months equals your menopause. That's becoming a more difficult definition for us to hold on to, right? Because
Interesting.
there are more and more people who've had a hysterectomy, but their ovaries are still there. How are you going to use periods now to determine that they're in menopause? You're never going to be able to. People who've had an endometrial ablation or who have a progesterone IUD in place, those women have, or those people have ovaries that are still functioning. But when they start to have hot flushes or night sweats or mood problems, you can't go, oh, well, what's happening with your bleeding pattern? Have you been 12 months yet so that we know what to do with you? Like that, you can't do that, right? And so it becomes more important for those people who we don't have a bleeding pattern to follow to actually use a symptom tracking calendar to start mapping it out. Because if you can see that these things are coming and going, then arguably if you still had a bleeding organ like your uterus, then you'd be able to also put that onto that chart to see how these things are following with your period. But without your period, those symptoms like your mood and your hot flushes and your night sweats that come and go, that's now our indicator of what's going on with your ovaries, right?
Yeah.
So when people are having severe symptoms, and the cognitive issues that you were mentioning, even once people, if you have a uterus and you hit that 12-month mark, it might not be that immediately at that point something drastically changes with your symptoms, because some people have been having very erratic and low levels of estrogen for months at a time before they then have another sporadic little period. Some people's perimenopause goes on for quite some time before, if they have a uterus, you can see 12 months of no period, right?
Yeah.
So they've often been having lots of low estrogen times for a while, versus there are some people who seem to kind of have a lot of monthly cycles, and they really do kind of seem to very suddenly fall off and end. And so even that 12-month mark isn't necessarily a good benchmark for saying, when can you expect your symptoms to go away? Because again, a lot of people will come to me and say, well, when is my menopause going to end?
Right.
Or even just yesterday, I had a client who said, well, my mom didn't have menopause. And I said, okay, you're referring to the symptoms, the classic symptoms of hot flushes and night sweats. There are people who won't have those. There are people who won't have horrible cognitive issues. And there are people who will. So, observing how long your hot flushes or your night sweats, or even your cognitive fog and changes, how long those last in your overall menopause transition might be for, months or years beyond your final menstrual period. It's a matter of, how your body adjusts to this new menopausal phase. And so people's cognitive symptoms might, still continue on years into their actual, officially diagnosed menopause.
Yeah.
But you're right in that the data is clear to say those symptoms should not be over exaggerated as being an early indicator that you have dementia. The Menopause Society meeting actually had a couple different really good presentations about this, saying, there are mice models that we're using to try to understand this. The ApoE gene mutation, the ApoE4 gene is important in this. But overall, it's really important for us to chat with our clients about other things that they can do to reduce their dementia risk, right? The healthy lifestyle stuff, the exercise, the cognitive challenges, having, positive relationships in your life, having connections and social connections, being active, choosing nutrition, choosing exercise. Those are still coming out as being the top ways that you can do things to improve your brain health and reduce your dementia risk overall.
Yeah, those are so important. Can we talk about testing? Because I think this is another misconception. Women come in, they're like, can we test to see if I'm in perimenopause? And then I have to gently let them down and be like, there is no test. But especially for women, like you said, where they have an IUD or they've had an ablation or they've had a hysterectomy and we don't have a cycle to help us. Do you sometimes use testing? And if so, like what kind of cases do you find testing could be helpful for?
Testing is helpful if people are exceptionally young, like in premature ovarian insufficiency. We do have like a recommended list of tests that we should send people for, which includes some autoimmune panels and such to see if there are, thyroid conditions or other things that might be giving us clues as to why they're having menopause early. For people going through menopause at a routine age, there aren't tests to diagnose that it's your menopause per se. You might benefit as well, though, depending on how your symptoms look, from checking your thyroid, looking at your hemoglobin A1C, determining if you have other things in your life that do need to be assessed that, might be hormonal or might not be hormonal. But trying to use, say, follicle stimulating hormone or estradiol levels as a diagnostic tool in your perimenopause is fraught with inaccuracy. And it's because 1 month you might be making follicles and estrogen levels, no problem. So your estradiols will be high. And then the next month you're having hot flushes and symptoms and your estrogen levels are low and your FSH is high. But then if you go to your doctor and say, I'd like to have it diagnosed that I'm in perimenopause, I think a lot of women are asking for that because they feel like people don't believe them.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like in other areas of health, we can diagnose your thyroid and then that can give you sort of some justification that what you're going through is not in your head, right? I think because women have been so gaslit for so long about their menopause symptoms, they really want something that is definitive so that they can say, I told you so.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't feel well. I told you so. And now I know why, right?
Yeah.
And that's the problem with perimenopause is that every month to month, it can be very different. And if you don't have a uterus or you don't have bleeding, same thing. So if you're, you know, young and early on and we're trying to figure it out, yes, we might order your FSH levels, you know, and your estradiol levels. We can decide that we're going to randomly try to order them a few months apart to see if we can see that there's generally a trend that, yes, when we've repeated it over and over again, your FSH is consistently high, your estradiol is consistently low. But in my practice, I can't say that that is much more beneficial than saying, track your symptoms.
That's right.
Write them down. And so that we can see, are they coming and going? If they were coming and going for a while, and now you're saying, now I haven't had a break from these hot flushes and night sweats, you know, for the last, 6 months, 8 months. Well, then again, you have to be using your brain to be thinking through, what do we see when we can observe a bleeding pattern? Take that bleeding pattern out of it, and you can still make, some good clinical diagnoses of what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I agree with that. Can we talk about timing of hormones? You talked about this a little bit earlier, and I think this is something I see. One would be talking about like when to start, but the other thing that I see a lot in my practice is women turn 60 and they are told by their GP, time to stop your hormones. They come off their hormones. Some are fine, some are not fine. So can we talk about like kind of like, what do we know about the best time to start? And the question my patients always ask, like, how long am I going to be on this? How long should I be on this?
Yeah. Well, I mean, when to start should be determined by your symptoms, right? Now that being said, I do have now people who are coming to me when we can't even really quite tell that they're in perimenopause yet, right? I have women now who are hearing all of this going on social media. They're wanting to be referred to me in their 30s because they want to know if they're in perimenopause and they should start on hormone therapy because they've heard out there that earlier you start, the better, and they've heard that earlier starts may be more likely associated with prevention and such. And so now you have people who are keen to do things for their health and actually wanting to start before we even know that it's going to be helping you, right? So, that might be overcalling it a little bit. That might be a little bit too early, right? So the earliest stages of perimenopause can actually be that your cycles get a little bit closer together and even a little bit heavier. And for some people, they might start having some of those, it's almost like, PMS cranked to level 10, right?
Exactly.
It's because their levels are fluctuating higher and lower on a month-to-month basis, but they haven't yet been, lacking an ability to ovulate on a monthly basis. Okay. They still have enough egg quality or enough egg quantity, and quality that when those eggs are recruited every month, there's still something that can ovulate every month. So those situations are not people in low estrogen states, right? Mm-hmm. They're still making gobs of estrogen. It's the rockiness of the waves that is starting to really, give them symptoms. So in lots of those cases, giving of these very low doses of menopausal hormone therapy is a drop in the bucket. Mm-hmm. It doesn't really impact on their symptoms because it's not doing anything to just reduce the waves or stop their ovulations. So that might be too early. But if you're getting to the point where your symptoms are changing or you want to experiment, there are ways, when you're getting further into your perimenopause, that as long as you are accommodating for your uterus lining, and that might be a progesterone IUD, that might be cycling the progesterone. The progesterone component is something that's important for people who have a uterus and have any sort of bleeding. You need to have something like that on board in order to then experiment with estrogen doses. Mm-hmm. Or of course, if people are early in that transition, that is when we talk about very low dose birth control pills, because the therapeutic need is to stop your wildly fluctuating ovulations. Okay. So that would be kind of on the side of, when should I start? When is early? For most people going through average menopause, they get to the point where, again, if they have a uterus and you can see them bleeding, their hot flushes or night sweats or their joint pain, their symptoms are ramping up and not really, they're not getting much relief from it. So then you need to have a discussion and say, is this the time to start hormones? Is this the time to start maybe some of the non-hormonal options? We do have evidence that some of the very, very low dose antidepressants are not accusing people of having a major depressive disorder, it's because those can impact on your thermoregulatory zone inside your brain. And for people who have mood dysfunction as part of their perimenopause, they might have some benefit from that. So it's worth then having a conversation about, could it be hormones? Should it be hormones? Could it be something else? And then once you get on to hormone therapy, provided that you started it early in that transition, then you started it when you didn't have cardiovascular disease. You started it when, hopefully you didn't have osteoporosis or any of those problems yet. And so that question of, well, then how long can I continue it for is, again, very individual. There are people whose hot flushes and night sweats might last a couple of years. There are people who are sort of referred to as super flashers, who at any age they might try coming off of their hormone therapy, or, they go on vacation and they forget it, or their prescription runs out and they just can't get coordinated with their doctor. And so they're off of it and they come back with a vengeance. Well, those are people who need to then seriously be considering being long-term users. And there are guidelines about that. It's a myth to suggest that women have to stop at an arbitrary endpoint. Which should that number be, right? Yeah. The number that's often floated around has been 5 years. Well, why 5 years? 5 years probably because in the Women's Health Initiative, 2002, when they started to look at the data, they thought that at the 5-year mark was when they started to see maybe this creeping up of some of these risks with hormone therapy. So then that became, I think, a bit of an urban myth to say, oh, you're good until 5 years. And then at that point, hormone therapy somehow becomes dangerous. Well, that hasn't been promoted by any of the Menopause Society guidelines. Equally with 10 years, equally with age. There isn't a guideline around the world that will say you have to stop at age 60. What happens if your menopause happened at 56, right? There isn't a guideline either that says that you have to stop at 65 or 70. This is where that individualized conversation comes in of risk and benefit, of reassessing on a yearly basis, saying, how is your health overall? Have you developed other conditions? How are your mammograms? How is your bone health doing? Have you missed any doses? Have you noticed if your hot flushes are still there? Or if you were started on it specifically for osteoporosis prevention because you started off at high risk, then those people might benefit from being on low doses long term, right? And so even the Menopause Society actually has a very concise statement, which I'll show to you just so that you've got it for reference later if you don't have this one already. And we can put the reference in the notes for the listeners. But this specific statement is very concise, and it says that when people are having symptoms, even beyond the age of 65, there can be a significant group of women that if you try stopping their hormone therapy and they're 60 sometime, their symptoms are still there. Yeah. And so do a risk-benefit analysis about continuing, right? So there, and I know that answer can sound really complex and wishy-washy to people who are like, am I stuck on this? Mm-hmm. If I go on to hormone therapy, am I now sentenced to this for the rest of my life? How do I ever come off of it? And there isn't one answer to that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really going to depend. And I know that's so hard for women, but it really is going to be, you're going to have to try and figure out how your body does without it and whether you prefer to be on it or not. Yeah. So for women who are listening and who are feeling maybe a little bit more informed and empowered about menopause and feeling like they are in perimenopause and that they want to talk about their treatment options, how are you kind of recommending or telling women to kind of navigate these conversations with their GPs? Because in an ideal world, we would all have access to our own Dr. Piper, our own kind of menopause-informed gynecologist, but that's not the state of our healthcare system right now. So do you have any tips or suggestions for women on how to navigate these conversations, especially with GPs who they don't have specific menopause training?
Well, in an ideal world, we're going to get to a point where family doctors do appreciate this again and don't try to avoid it with all their might, right? Like in the 90s, before the Women's Health Initiative came out, family doctors and primary care providers were asking people about their menopause and they were putting them onto hormone therapy without hesitation, right? It was seen as what it is, a physiologic stage similar to puberty, similar to pregnancy, where we can just learn about it, we can talk about it, we can manage it, right? So now this last 2 decades of fear of hormone therapy has kind of put menopause even under the rug. And that's been a real shame. And that's been a miss by the physician community that we stopped even caring and asking women about their menopause because it is more than, menopausal hormone therapy. So that's for one. So when you're wanting to now have a discussion with your physician that, might not be asking you, because hopefully, again, in the next few years, we'll get around to more family doctors at least taking the responsibility to ask you the question, come prepared, right? Come with a symptom tracker if you're in perimenopause. come with one of the menopause symptom score sheets, like the MenQual or the Green Climacteric Scale. These are published menopause symptom charts, that can give you some scores. Speak the language of your doctor, right? Come with evidence-based, trustworthy information that they are going to see is a good resource, right? Go to places like the Australasian Menopause Society, where they have a plethora of information sheets about all sorts of different menopausal topics, right? Come with a specific handout about what your issue is. They have, 2-3 pages long, as are the typical length of one of those handouts. They have references at the end. They have a date that says when they were updated. They have the banner of that Menopause Society across the top. These are good, trustworthy documents that can educate you yourself, get you an idea of what's going on with your body, let you understand what your therapeutic options are. And then if you come into your doctor with something like that, you can have a better level of conversation, because if they're also learning about this, you actually might be then creating a situation where they are learning alongside of you, rather than you are pointing out to them their lack of education, and they don't have a tool in order to help you. So then the conversation just gets shut down, and they're like, well, I don't know how to answer this question, so I'm just going to refer you on. Or of course, the worst case scenario is them saying that it's probably not your menopause and brushing you off, right? Yeah. So, realize that there are doctors who are in various stages of this learning process. There are some who've gone to the Menopause Society meetings and are learning and are, maybe new in their skill set when it comes to learning how to manage menopause, but they're trying. There are people who are receptive. So when people come to me, I'm always asking them and saying, look, your family doctor, your primary care provider might not have the skill set to have the hour-long conversation that you and I just had about doing your risk assessment, talking about, the appropriate conversation about what you've heard about the data and such. They might not have those skill sets, but once you and I get onto the right hormone therapy regime, they might be quite receptive to continuing it without, making you feel like you've made a bad choice. And then there's a third set of physicians out there who are just resistant, right? There are definitely physicians out there who I will always see. They are refusing to do refills. They are refusing to say anything to their clients beyond hormone therapy will give you breast cancer. You have to give up on those ones for now, right? It's not your job as a client, as a patient, to try to convince them otherwise, when even someone like me is not having success, right? Mm-hmm. So if that's the case, try to not frustrate yourself. If that physician is still otherwise giving you good care, try to compartmentalize at this point and not, sacrifice the otherwise good therapeutic relationship you have with them because they're not up to date on that. And then seek an alternate provider, right? All people who are going through menopause, if their own primary care provider cannot offer them help, get the tools, see where else you can be referred. If you're going to use an alternate primary care provider, potentially even one that if you have the funds you're paying for, check them out, make sure that they are evidence-based, make sure that they're not only saying that they're doing compounded bioidentical and sending you for Dutch test after Dutch test, mm-hmm. Be careful about the other type of provider that you might choose to help you with your menopause, because there's a long list of people who will happily take you on and tell you that they're going to help you with your menopause, and then they're giving you non-evidence-based advice.
Yeah, definitely. The Menopause Society has a good, you can look up doctors who are certified, I think could be one place to start. Like if you're looking for a provider.
Yeah.
Okay.
They do have a database now, of course. Not all Menopause Society providers have necessarily agreed to put their name on that list. Right. There might be that little complication. There might be people who are good at their job and doing menopause, but maybe have let their Menopause Society certification expire, and so they're not going to pop up there either, right? But you're right that the Menopause Society database is a good one. I do think that hopefully in the near future, the Canadian Menopause Society might try to do a similar type of database. That can be a resource. Yeah.
Okay. I want to make sure that we leave today's conversation maybe on a positive note, because I think when a lot of women think about menopause, it's often this very negative experience where it's, oh God, like I finally like raised my kids and now I have to go through freaking menopause. Like this is so unfair.
How cruel.
I know, how cruel. Like we never get a break. But I also think menopause can be an opportunity for like a new chapter. And we know there is some research showing that like women who have more self-compassion tend to have better menopause experiences. And I think, again, it can be this opportunity to like maybe shift the focus away from, especially if you were a parent, like not away from your children, but like redirecting some of that energy that we were giving and placing it back on ourselves. Like, what are some of the conversations that you're maybe having with your clients around like menopause is maybe like a new opportunity or a new chapter to embrace?
Absolutely. We shouldn't see this as doom and gloom, right? We should see this as an opportunity to refocus our attention, like you said, and our energies on health. Because if you haven't approached and reached your menopause from a state of already, having attention paid to your nutrition, being active, doing the mixture of activities that will give you flexibility and cardiovascular health and muscular health and bone health, then this is your time. This is your moment, because the data does show that with age, not specifically necessarily with menopause, but with age, our bodies respond to stimuli differently, and recovery, times can be different. And so at menopause transition, if you haven't already been looking at your nutrition, thinking about cutting out excess processed foods and excessive, refined sugars, if you haven't already been thinking about your heart health and doing some flexibility training and particularly strength training, this is the time to start doing so, because that is what builds us resilience as we're aging for the next number of decades. And so take menopause as an opportunity to, take stock of your life and say, where in here can I also help people around me who have been depending on me to realize that I need to be doing these things for myself so that I can continue to show up for them, right? I think a lot of moms and a lot of women in their careers, in their 30s and 40s, they're just going on steam because they do. That's just the decade. Our genetics are different. Our energy levels are different. And at some point, there's a reckoning, and you have to decide if this is a long-term sustainable and healthy choice for you or not. And a lot of us have gotten ourselves into situations where it isn't sustainable, but we did it for a certain amount of time to survive. Everyone does that with their newborns. Everyone does that with a job transition, but these cannot be long-term, continued patterns if they're not really beneficial for your health. So flipping that narrative to being hopeful, to focusing on things that you can improve and change, to realizing that this is an opportunity for you to have better nutrition, better health. There are definitely people who have become stronger and more confident and more positive through and after their menopause transition than they ever were before. Right? So find yourself a community of people who are optimistic, who aren't just commiserating, who will help you and to reach those goals. Realize that the people you are surrounding yourself with, you might soon become similar to. So if you are surrounding yourself with people who are doom and gloom and negative and pessimistic and etc., try to find yourself a community of people. Try to evolve your community over to those who can be part of you in a positive journey going forward.
I love that. And that's a conversation I have with my patients all the time, this idea of like energy management. And I think menopause is a beautiful time to do a bit of like a life or an energy inventory and really have like an honest look at who and where and what you are spending your energy on, and really thinking about, is that who and what and where I want to spend my energy on as I transition in this new phase of life. And also like giving yourself permission and having the confidence and the self-compassion to realize that you deserve and need to do the things that bring you energy and that bring you joy, and that it is not a selfish thing to put those things back into your life. It is an absolute necessity. And like, this has really shifted for me in the last few years. I'm like, my fitness goals, like the reason I go to my Pilates twice a week and I go for my walk every day and I do all the things, it's not because I'm trying to lose weight. It's because I see the 80-year-old ladies who live in the building beside me, and I want to be able to carry my groceries and be independent. That's literally what I'm 41 and I'm already like, I want to be healthy and strong when I'm in my 80s. And so much of the habits and things that we put into place through this perimenopause and menopause transition, it really does set us up for a long, healthy life.
Yeah. And you have to shoot over what you want to be able to do as maintenance. You can't consider lifting groceries as your strength training exercise.
No.
You actually have to lift things that are significantly stronger so that carrying those groceries is easy, right? And so this concept of progression of being kind to yourself, being honest, starting off where you are, not running yourself down that you're not where you thought you should be or where that person over there is, starting where you are, making some decisions about what you can change today that will be sustainable, that will be positive for you, that, 2 months from now, you will still have that change in your life. And now it is permanent. You got to make those small progressive moves in the right direction and think about where do you want to be a year from now, 2 years from now. Not, I want to fit into that dress in the next 2 months for that wedding, or I don't like this number on the scale. If those are continue to be our outcomes and our goals, which, most of us unfortunately learned from, like the 80s and the 90s diet culture, those are not the right goals anymore. And so you have to let go of those unhelpful measures of success and find yourself new measures of success that really reflect where you are and where you want to go.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Piper. I know our listeners learned a lot today about menopause. If you want to learn more about Dr. Piper and her services, please visit the Byward Family Health Team website. She has a telemedicine practice and serves women from all over Ontario, and we'll link to that website in the show notes below. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and we will see you back here in a couple weeks. Thanks for spending your precious time with me today. Remember, it takes a village or a podcast community to really make a dent in this fatigue epidemic. If today's episode resonated with you, do me a favor. Share it with a friend or two, and if you have a second, drop us that shiny 5-star review. It means so much to me. Are you eager to solve your own personal energy puzzle? Hop on over to fatiguefixer.ca/quiz and check out my fatigue fingerprint quiz. Let's pinpoint what's standing between you and feeling your best. A big thank you to Jen Hudson and Drew Gardner over at Story Studio Network for bringing these conversations to life. And hey, just so you know, I've got your back. Your fatigue, it's super real, and it's definitely not just all in your mind. I see you and I believe you. Every 2 weeks, we'll keep these heart-to-hearts going, learning together and cheering each other on. Because between you and me, accepting perpetual exhaustion as the norm, that's not going to fly around here. See you back here in 2 weeks. Bye!